It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Philips 326 M6 VJRNB, and as usual that's a complete mouthful. Philips love doing that with their model numbers. If you want to, you can just call it the Momentum 326M for short. As usual, this video review accompanies a written review, and you can find a link to that alongside information about how you can support the work that we do in the description of the video. You have to remember that what you see on the video does not accurately reflect what the monitor will look like in person. It's influenced by what happens on my camera, the editing done by my video editing software, by YouTube, and ultimately by the screen that you're viewing the video on. This monitor uses a 31.5-inch VA panel, or more specifically an AAS panel, which stands for Azimuthal Anchoring Switch, a complete mouthful, just like Philips model numbers. But basically it's a VA vertical alignment type of panel. It's characteristically a VA panel. This has a resolution of 3840 by 2160, so that delivers a really nice pixel density on a screen of this size. It also gives you a really nice amount of desktop real estate. So you can see the size of my icons here. I mean, it's difficult to see in the video, but I can use this monitor no problems without using any scaling at all for my preferred viewing distance, and that's around 70 to 80 centimeters, maybe a little bit closer sometimes depending on my posture, but I do find it very much usable without any scaling. Some users might want to use a low level of scaling or application specific zoom. It's a very personal thing really, but generally speaking you'd use a lower amount of scaling, if any scaling, versus a 27-inch or 28-inch model of this kind of resolution. Gives you a really nice amount of desktop real estate, good for multitasking. So you can see I've got a Word document open here. You can see lots of words at the same time. Same with this website here, my website. And so it's really good for productivity purposes or whatever else you might be doing. The text is also nice and crisp because of the pixel density. And the overall look, if you're looking at high resolution image content, suitably high resolution content, such as the games I'll be showing you shortly, they certainly have a distinct UHD or 4K UHD look to them, and that's very much the same as what you get on a smaller UHD model, or I feel it's the same. And it's something which has lost somewhat on larger models, for example 43-inch UHD models. They have a slacker pixel density, but this model, it's very much like a 4K UHD experience in terms of the detail and clarity. There's further explanation of what to expect in that respect in the written review, and also we've got an article all about the 4K UHD experience exploring this kind of thing. One thing I like to mention fairly early on in my videos is the screen surface. So when observing lighter content such as white here, there is a little bit of a graininess to the image. It's not extreme, it's not a heavy or smeary graininess, but it does use a medium matte anti-glare screen surface, or relatively light depending on how you choose to classify it. And this isn't the smoothest or lightest screen surface I've seen, so there is a little bit of graininess, and if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, it could be a bit bothersome, but as I said, it's not too bad. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. The monitor has a glossy black bezel. It's a single stage design rather than a dual stage design. It's moderately thick compared to some modern bezels, although not super thick. I'm not a huge fan of glossy black plastics, as you'll know from my previous work, but you know, I can live with it. It's what I call a fingerprint and dust magnet, glossy black plastic. The stand has a kind of wireframe design. It's quite artistic looking, sort of like a sculpture of sorts, quite an interesting little design there. And the stand itself doesn't offer much ergonomic flexibility to the monitor though. It has a nice, fairly solid feel, given that it's quite a thin stand, or thin looking stand. It's made of metal, it's powder coated metal, so it has some decent weight to it. It's quite solid, but it only offers tilt as an ergonomic flexibility to the monitor, so you can't adjust the height or swivel it or pivot it or anything like that with the included stand. The main feature from the front though is the screen itself, of course a large screen, and that has a medium or relatively light, depending on how you choose to classify it, matte anti-glare finish to it. So this offers quite good glare handling, has a bit of an impact on the image as we explore elsewhere in the review. From the side, the monitor has a reasonably slender design. It lumps out where the stand attaches, but the actual screen itself, for the most part, is quite thin from this angle. You can also see the stand itself is reasonably deep, although not super deep. The screen itself sits a little way back from the front of the stand, and that helps in that it gives you a little bit more distance between your eyes and the screen if you don't have a particularly deep desk. From the rear, there's plenty more of that wonderful glossy black plastic and a bit of matte black plastic as well. But other than that, fairly minimalistic at the back. The stand attaches using a quick release mechanism. So if you press the button there, just beneath the stand attachment point, the screen will detach. Obviously I don't want to do that right now, but you can replace it with an alternative 100 by 100mm VESA compatible solution if you prefer. There's a little joystick that controls the OSD there, and that's explored in a separate video all about the OSD. There are also two up-firing speakers. These offer reasonable sound output as explored in the written review. The ports of the monitor are down-firing. They include a DC power input, which means that the monitor has an external power brick. There are three HDMI 2.0 ports. There's DisplayPort 1.4. That's a USB 3 upstream port, and then there are four USB 3 downstream ports. The yellowed coloured ones support fast charging for connected devices. And then there is a 3.5mm audio input and a 3.5mm headphone jack. And this is the power brick here, so it's a fairly hefty design. It's quite brick-like. I mean, it's not quite as tall as some power bricks I've seen, but it is certainly quite a large one. Last but not least, there is a Kensington lock slot, a little case lock there. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This particular scene is fairly typical for this kind of game. There are plenty of dark and bright elements combined, and it's scenes like this which really show off a strong contrast performance and really demand a strong contrast performance. And on VA models like this, with really quite decent static contrast, this kind of scene really does appear quite nice. Following the adjustments made to my test settings, I measured a static contrast of around 3400 to 1. So that is strong. It's much stronger than a non-VA LCD panel would produce outside of HDR. And speaking of HDR, this is just running the game in SDR at the moment, and everything I'm talking about at the moment is just SDR observations. And that delivers a nice depth to the dark areas such as this, and the brighter shades such as the fire there stand out really nicely. I should also mention a few things. The camera is mounted in a way which is supposed to better represent what your eye would see in terms of the position, so it's not quite in the centre of the screen, it's a little bit above that, and that's the ergonomically correct viewing position. But the camera does exaggerate some things which I'm going to talk about, specifically VA glow. So you can see this towards the edges at times. The camera adjusts, as you see, when I'm pointing towards that bright element there, and it really sort of highlights the VA glow. It's not quite as obvious as this in real life, so to speak, but you can see it there in those regions. But it's generally more subdued, a bit more like what you might see now, and you generally just see it a bit towards the bottom of the monitor, but compared to something like IPS glow, it's really very subtle, and compared to the VA glow on some VA models even, it's really not a major issue. It's sort of a fairly low amount of VA glow as far as VA panels go, especially this kind of size. So it doesn't really detract from the atmosphere, so to speak. As a VA panel, the perceived gamma changes depending on which area of the screen you're looking at. So the bit you're looking at directly, which is generally the centre of the screen from a normal viewing position, that actually has a much higher perceived gamma than the edges of the screen. And this leads to something which is called black crush. So essentially the dark shades, for example, Lara there and her attire and the sort of bits surrounding the rope there, there are lots of dark shades there which are more blended than they should be, actually darker than they should be, and they essentially sort of blend into a dark mass, and some of the detail is lost. It's not as detailed as it should be. If you move your viewing position so you're not observing them centrally, or also if I simply moved the mouse and they were sort of towards the edge of the screen, it would have a similar effect. You can see that extra detail is observable, so the perceived gamma is now significantly lower, and those darker shades aren't as deep, so they don't blend into one another. The perceived gamma shifts are exaggerated by the fact that this is quite a large screen, and also the panel itself, it's not quite as good in this respect as some of the models I've tested, for example, with curved VA panels of this kind of size. So the perceived gamma shifts are more pronounced, and from a normal viewing position, there's actually extra detail that shouldn't really be visible towards the edges, but it's not extreme, and by that I mean it's not like what you'd see on a TN panel when you're observing the bottom of the screen. There'd be obvious extra gamma would be significantly lower there, and you'd see a huge amount of extra detail. It gives a kind of blocky appearance, banding, whatever you want to call it. That does happen to some degree, sort of at the extreme edges on this model from normal viewing position, but it's really not as extreme as on TN models vertically. But in terms of the black crush as well, it is a bit more pronounced than I've seen on some VA models, particularly those with curved panels. So I've got some nice bright content on the screen as well, and I will just emphasize again that stands out really nicely against the darker surroundings on this model. I will also mention that the screen surface again is a bit of graininess to those brighter shades. You won't be able to see that on the video, but I can see it to my eye. It's something I'm quite sensitive to, so just be aware of that. But as I said earlier, it's not extreme on this model, it's just a little bit of a feature. I'm now going to talk about colour reproduction. As usual, I like to start this section off by looking at Lagom, that's lagom.nl, and the tests for viewing angles there. This will neatly tie into what I was talking about earlier in terms of the perceived gamma shifts, because this doesn't just affect those dark shades I was talking about, or just sort of the visibility in general. It also affects colours and various other shades. So you can see this with the Lagom text test. It looks fairly blended overall if you're quite far back. If you sort of from a normal viewing position, there's a kind of area in the middle which has a bit of a green tint to the text, but then surrounding that at the edges, there's sort of more of a red tint, and it just appears a bit different. And as you move your head, or I move the camera, you can see that red tint shift, and the more blended sort of green area shifts along with your head movement, or the area of your screen that you're sort of more or less directly in front of. So ideally that would all be blended and you wouldn't see that kind of shift, but you don't see the kind of shifts you would see on TN models vertically, and you'd see sort of an obvious gradient between sort of green and red and orange and some greater flashes of various shades vertically. The purple block appears quite purple towards the middle in that kind of cone, if you like, with that kind of cone I was talking about before, the sort of the central region, whereas towards the edges of the screen it has more of a pink hue, and this pink hue shifts along with head movement. The red block appears a fairly vibrant red throughout, but it does appear sort of a more faded red further out, and then kind of more of a pinkish hue at the extreme edges. And again, this does shift along with head movement quite readily. And from a normal viewing position, you can certainly sort of see some differences when you're comparing the central region of the screen to the peripheral sections. The green block looks a nice, vibrant, saturated chartreuse technically throughout the screen. It looks a bit more yellow towards the edges of the screen, but because of the colour gamut being rather generous, this does actually look a bit more saturated and greenish rather than yellowish on this model for this particular shade. But there are shifts, and again they do shift with head movements, but the shifts here in general are not as obvious as with the other shades I was showing you. The blue block, as usual, this appears pretty consistent throughout really. It's just a good royal blue, a good deep blue, and it doesn't really have sort of characteristic shifts comparing the centre to the edges of the screen. There can be some weaknesses in uniformity which would cause the edges to look different to the centre of the screen or various other shifts, but they vary from unit to unit and they're not specific to the viewing angle characteristics. I'm now running Battlefield 5 and I'm going to continue to talk about colour reproduction. This scene I really like for showing off vibrant colour reproduction on monitors. This model certainly does have a rather vibrant look to the image. There are some really nice rich reds for the vegetation here and rich autumnal browns and various sort of golden brown hues as well. The earth as well has a rich sort of reddish brown hue, and this is largely down to the colour gamut of the monitor, which extends well beyond sRGB. And what that means is that for content like this is just running an SDR. It's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. If you're looking at this at a larger colour gamut, and this model actually covers a lot of the DCI-P3 colour space, which is significantly wider than sRGB. If you view that kind of content on this kind of colour gamut, things do naturally look more saturated, but you also maintain the variety of shades because there's spacing on the gamut and things are spread out. So the more muted pastel shades again appear more saturated than they should, but they appear a lot less saturated than the vibrant or deep shades, which should appear very saturated. And that's very different to what you get if you simply increase the digital vibrance setting, for example, NVIDIA Digital Vibrance control, or this monitor doesn't have a specific control for this as far as I remember, but sometimes there's sort of a saturation control in the monitor itself. If you increase that, it doesn't have the same effect as increasing the gamut or using a large colour gamut. That simply pulls shades closer to the edge of the colour gamut without expanding the colour gamut itself. That compresses the shade range, makes things look really artificial and crushed up. There are some weaknesses in terms of the colours losing a bit of saturation towards the edges. I showed you with Lagom really, the loss of saturation and changes further out towards the edges of the screen. This may not be so obvious in the video, and it's not a particularly strong difference, and certainly if you're comparing again to those TN models and you're looking at the vertical viewing angles, there'd be an obvious saturation shift where things are sort of washed out towards the bottom, way too deep towards the top. There's nothing like that, but there are certainly some shifts, and even if you move your head slightly, you can sort of observe these shifts fairly readily. And they also are more pronounced if you sit close to the monitor, whereas if you're further away, they sort of decrease. Things appear more evenly saturated, although there are still some shifts as you move your head, as I mentioned. For my preferred viewing distance, which is around 70 centimeters, give or take, these shifts are not extreme, and the image does look quite vibrant throughout the screen, even with this. You might be able to see some instances of a bit of loss of saturation towards the edges, but again, it really doesn't come across in an obvious way on the video, and it's not an extreme difference. If you compare them to an IPS type panel, yes, these shifts are certainly more pronounced, and saturation isn't maintained as well throughout the screen. As I mentioned, that large colour gamut really does give strong saturation and stronger than intended saturation. As I mentioned, there are lots of sort of rich reddish earthy browns. They do have more of a reddish hue than they should. The wood there, for example, should look a more muted brown than it does. These autumnal reds, although they're very eye-catching, very vibrant, they're also more red than they should be. Some of the oranges are deeper than they should be, and the yellow sort of verge on orange, that kind of thing. So this colour gamut does certainly make things look more vibrant, but it's not good in terms of things looking accurate or as the developers intended. But that's a look that many users will like, and many users have sort of become accustomed to, with colour gamuts on phones these days even being particularly broad. People are sort of used to this kind of look to an extent. I've now switched on HDR. I've turned the game onto HDR, and things look very different. You'll be able to see on the video that things look different, although you won't be able to see the exact nature of these differences. And one thing you will notice as well when I move the mouse and stuff, you might notice some flickering on the screen. That isn't a defect of HDR specifically, but I'm using an NVIDIA GPU and I'm using adaptive sync at the moment, and I explore that in the responsiveness section, but this monitor does not support HDR and adaptive sync with an NVIDIA GPU at the same time. It's one or the other. If you're using an AMD GPU, you can use FreeSync and HDR at the same time, but with the NVIDIA GPU, when you're having the frame rate fluctuating, so it's going to drop a little bit below 60 frames a second at times, that's when you get the flickering. The flickering is just an unfortunate side effect of HDR and adaptive sync on the NVIDIA GPU. I've now switched off adaptive sync, so that'll get rid of that flickering you were observing before. You might not be able to see it on the video, but I could certainly see it to my eye, and I was finding it quite bothersome. So this monitor supports VESA Display HDR 600, or I should say it's VESA Display HDR 600 compliant, and that's a moderately high level of VESA Display HDR certification. It certainly isn't the lowest level anyway, so it does need to tick certain boxes for HDR, and as usual for HDR on the PC, or for monitors that are connected to games consoles as well, it supports HDR10, the HDR10 pipeline. So there are certain sort of boxes which this will tick. One is the colour gamut, as I mentioned before, strong DCI-P3 coverage. Philips specifies, if I remember correctly, a little bit above 98% DCI-P3. I did measure the colour gamut. Unfortunately, my colorimeter doesn't allow direct comparison with DCI-P3, but having looked at the colour space that I'd measured and comparing that to some other references, yes, it certainly does offer strong DCI-P3 coverage. And that is the colour gamut which is now being targeted by the game, and it's targeted by HDR content in general. And what that means is you don't get this sort of extra saturation anymore. Things are toned down. The game developers can certainly put in strong saturation where they want it. So these brightly painted objects here, the green there and the red there, they're way more saturated than you'd see within the sRGB colour gamut. So these are just some examples of shades which extend way beyond the sRGB colour gamut and look nice and saturated. Fires as well. I always mention that on this. I might show you some in a little bit. I'll get a bit further into the level, but sort of vibrant oranges and reds really look excellent for fires as well. And the vegetation here, it looks very vibrant, but it's lost a bit of its overly red hue. It looks a more natural sort of autumnal colour now, for the oranges and the yellows there. And the earthy browns there, they look nice and rich as well, and certainly richer than I'd expect within the sRGB colour space, but they don't have that extra red hue. So they look more natural and more appropriate. And there are some really nice lush greens, and I'll show you them on Tomb Raider actually, because the area of Tomb Raider I'm going to be showing you when I'm talking about HDR there. It's a bit better for showing this. Actually, this green here for this vegetation, again, that's really lush, really deep. I'm just about to get killed here, but at least I'm going to get killed whilst admiring this nice lush green, really nice and deep. And without HDR, this sort of has a bit too much of a yellow hint. It has too much of a yellow hue, so it's certainly nicer. The colours are represented in a very nice way, and the colour gamut's put to very good use under HDR. There are various other aspects of HDR as well, and differences you will observe, and not necessarily obvious on the video, and certainly you won't be able to see things exactly as you would see them in person under HDR naturally, but I'm going to talk about these a bit more with Tomb Raider, using Tomb Raider as an example. But the game basically looks very different, and I haven't changed any of the graphics settings, I've simply applied HDR. But one thing is that the monitor now uses 10-bit colour reproduction. It supports 10-bit precision, so does the GPU, and so does the HDR content. That's different to SDR content, which would be limited to 8 bits typically. Or possibly always, I'm not really entirely sure, it's not exactly my area, but certainly HDR supports, or the HDR10 pipeline supports 10-bit colour reproduction. This allows enhanced tone mapping, and this means that dark areas of the game, shadow details for example, you'll notice a much better variety of nuanced shades, and I'm going to show you this with more specific examples on Tomb Raider, but I'll actually be able to show you some of those nice vibrant orange shades if I don't get killed, and I can just blow up this barrel there. So the fire there under HDR looks more realistic, it looks very vibrant, way more vibrant than you'd see within the sRGB colour space, but it doesn't look overly red or overly orange. It just has a nice variety of vibrant oranges, vibrant yellows, and looks very nice. I'm now running Shadow of the Tomb Raider under HDR. I'm going to primarily talk about contrast, but since I'm running a different game title, I will talk a little bit about the other areas as well. Now under HDR, things again have a very different look, much as they did on Battlefield 5. And one of the reasons for that is, again, the 10-bit precision, the enhanced tone mapping, and this just gives a more realistic and believable look to those shadowy areas. It's very different because it's achieved with a greater variety of shades, very different to what you'd get if you simply decreased the gamma under SDR, for example. Very different to that, and this is just something which you don't get under SDR. The tone mapping as well, it also affects brighter shades. You can see the sun shining out of the canopy there. Unfortunately on the video this just looks like a big bright blob there, but to the eye there's an excellent variety of very bright shades, but they're not all super bright, some are slightly less bright, and it's much smoother. The sort of gradient of the sun's rays is way smoother than you'd see under SDR, and that's again part of the enhanced tone mapping. The greens here as well of the vegetation, they had more of a yellowish look under SDR. That's not to say they didn't look vibrant, they certainly did look vibrant and eye-catching, but less realistic under SDR. Under HDR, they again look vibrant and eye-catching, but also more believable. They're sort of lush and green rather than having an overly yellow cast to them. So I like to use this scene to talk primarily about contrast. As I mentioned, this monitor supports VESA Display HDR 600, and immediately here I can see that the excellent peak luminance, this monitor, I recorded actually a bit above 700 candles per meter squared. So it uses very high luminance for these bright areas. For example, the glint of the sun there has a certain pop to it that it just doesn't have under SDR. And this is also aided by the fact that this monitor uses local dimming. VESA Display HDR 600 does mandate a degree of local dimming. This monitor has 16 dimming zones, has 8 clusters of LEDs running along the left side, has 8 clusters of LEDs running along the right side, and it uses a light guide to fill that in to create 16 different dimming zones across the screen. That means that some dimming zones, for example the ones displaying this very bright content, can be much brighter than the dimming zones displaying the darker content. And that really does give an excellent contrasty look and a certain pop to those bright shades, and it keeps the darker shades looking a bit dimmer. As I'll come on to shortly, it doesn't work perfectly. I mean, 16 dimming zones obviously isn't a massive number for a screen of this size. Ideally, you would have per pixel illumination or a much higher number of dimming zones, and that would mean that these little sort of dark shaded areas beneath the vegetation or around the vegetation there would be much deeper and darker than they are. Because a dimming zone at the moment, for example, covers those dark shades, but it also covers some of the brighter shades there. The luminance sort of compromises on those zones, and sort of it can't just go completely dark or completely bright. It has a mixture of that, and it ends up lifting up the black point and making those dark shades less dark than they ideally would be. And certainly in a dark room, you can observe that the darker shades, for example here, appear significantly lighter than they should. If you're in a brighter room, I actually enjoy HDR more on this monitor in a brighter room, and it's not just because of the lack of depth, it's also because the high luminance levels can actually be quite fatiguing visually on your visual system, and observing this in a dark room really does accelerate that fatigue. So I find I can play for longer periods of time, and I find it more comfortable in a better lit viewing environment. And in such viewing environments, these sort of issues don't really stand out so much. I'm now running that scene I was showing you before when I was talking about contrast, and it looks very different indeed under HDR. I mean, you're not going to be able to see this in the video, but the fire there is really sort of blindingly bright, and it just looks like a ball of light in the video, I'm afraid. But there's an excellent variety of tones there, some really nice vibrant oranges and yellows, and really sort of bright white elements right in the middle. And it really does stand out, and it's not quite painful to look at, but it really does catch your eye in a way that some models just don't. Some models even under HDR just don't produce. And the same for the sort of glowing elements of this skull here. Again, bear in mind it's not shown properly in the video. Really nice. However, as I mentioned, the very dark shades, they're lighter than they should be. You can even see sort of a spotlighting effect from some of the dimming zones there. That's exaggerated on the video, but you do still see that, especially in a darker room like I'm sitting in at the moment. So that does break the atmosphere. The dark shades there surrounding the really bright shades, they're lifted up because the dimming zones are having to show these much brighter elements as well. And even the dimming zones which aren't actually showing the brighter shades, they're because of the very high luminance levels, they actually sort of flood into the dimming zones which should show the much darker shades. So even if those dimming zones are actually not very bright, you get sort of a flooding effect, and that does certainly affect the atmosphere. But even so, the overall look, I do still like it, and especially as I mentioned, observing in brighter viewing conditions. The lava here as well, it really just looks a lot more realistic. It looks almost like you're staring at the real thing. I mean, it's not that bright, and certainly there's some HDR models which have much higher luminance than this even. Certainly VESA Display HDR 1000 levels, for example, and some which would display over 1000 candles per meter squared. But even so, it's very eye-catching and very bright in a way that you just don't get under SDR, or indeed on some HDR displays, VESA Display HDR 400 level ones, for example. And again, the tone mapping here, very evident. The sort of nuanced variety of very dark shades shown there, again not going to be captured on the video, but the level of detail and the natural look there is really nice as well. So overall, I did really enjoy the HDR experience on this monitor. It's not perfect, as I've shown you, sort of the depth to the darker shades should certainly be better than it is, especially where there are lots of brighter shades on the screen. But the way it shows daylight in a very natural way is really nice. It makes very good use of the colour gamut, the 10-bit precision, So overall, it's really one of the more capable HDR experiences you'll find on a monitor these days. Some super quick additions to the HDR section. There's a few things I forgot to go through. What I've been showing you here under HDR, what I've been talking about, it's with the VESA Display HDR 600 mode active. If you go into the OSD, and I do mention this in the OSD video as well, you'll notice that a lot of things are grayed out. You don't really have much control over anything, but you can change the HDR mode between, well, you can set it to off, but obviously that's not under HDR, so that's not really relevant here. If you set it to the normal mode, it reduces the luminance levels a lot, and it really looks a lot dimmer. So those darker shades, yes, they have some more depth, but the brighter shades really just don't stand out, and things don't look like they should under HDR, and you're really missing out too much of that experience in my view. But if you're particularly sensitive to light, or perhaps you just want to take advantage of that colour gamut under HDR, or the tone mapping, that kind of thing, and you're not so bothered about the overall contrasty look and that kind of side of things, then this setting's certainly worth exploring. But regardless of which setting you use, I'm just going to set it back to the VESA HDR 600 mode, as it's called on the monitor. There's also a sharpness filter that's used, and it's not extreme on this model. I don't really notice it too much. It does give a slightly, some users might consider it gives a slightly less natural look, a slightly sort of sharper look, I suppose. But I think because of the pixel density on this monitor, I see it as something that's quite redundant, to be honest. It always looks rather sharp anyway. And I suppose it does enhance the sharpness or increase the sharpness, and some users may see that as a slightly artificial look rather than so natural. Although to me, I feel it actually complements the pixel density quite well, but it's also, as I said, quite redundant. So either way, I'd actually prefer if it was an option so the user could avoid using that filter at all if they wanted, or they could adjust the intensity of the sharpness filter. But this is really quite a mild sharpness filter. I don't think it does an awful lot. The sharpness filters in general, they're really designed under HDR to help accentuate the extra contrast and superior tone mapping, and sort of make those distinctions stand out even more. But really, I do see it's quite redundant on this model. The final thing, which is absolutely not something I could show you in a video, funnily enough, is that under HDR, especially when you're looking at lots of brighter content, and the dimming zones have been at really high luminances, you will notice that the monitor gets rather warm. It doesn't sort of burn my face off or anything like that, but if I put my hand near it, I can certainly feel, it feels a bit like a radiator. But I mean, I suppose it's not that hot. It's not really going to burn my hand or anything like that, but it is certainly very warm to the touch. That's completely normal. And also be aware that the power consumption under HDR will be higher. It is certainly going to be sucking up more electricity to drive the dimming zones to these very bright luminance levels. I'm now on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This is a 60Hz monitor, and I'm currently running at 60 frames a second. You can see that in the top right. There's a little frame rate counter there. 60 frames a second, so I'm getting the most out of the monitor in terms of responsiveness. As a 60Hz monitor, there's a moderate amount of perceived blur. A lot of that is linked to eye movement rather than the pixel response times, meaning that even if your monitor had really fast pixel response time, say 0.01 milliseconds for every single pixel transition, you'd still get this sort of mask of perceived blur due to the eye movement. That's explored in more detail in an article all about responsiveness on the website, and it's also summarised in the written review. Being a VA panel, there are some weaknesses in terms of the pixel responsiveness, which add further perceived blur. This particular map I'm on now, or this particular area I'm on now, it has a good range of transitions. There are some transitions involving slightly lighter shades, such as the lighter area of sky there, and the cliff faces moving against them as I move my mouse. And the monitor handles those sort of lighter to medium transitions really quite well. There isn't much additional trailing on top of what you'd ideally see on a 60Hz monitor, even if it had really fast pixel responses. So the perceived blur you see there is largely due to eye movement. There is a little bit of a mask of extra perceived blur. It's what I call light powdery trailing, and that's due to some pixel responses there being a bit weaker than optimal. There are some significantly slower than optimal pixel responses on this monitor though, and you will find them with any VA panel to some degree, and these involve the darker transitions or darker shades involved in the transitions, and there are plenty of dark shades here. So a good example of one of the slower transitions, you can see, I'm not sure if this doesn't always come out in the video, but so the dark shades here, you can see the wood there against the much lighter background, or the sort of medium shades in the background, the sky for example. And as you move your character around there, there's a significant sort of blur. It actually has a bit of a smeary quality to it, and there's a bit of what I'd call breakup trailing, and that's whereby some of the shades contained within either the object colour, so the wood there, or the background colour, they kind of leach out, as if you're wetting paper that has water-soluble ink on it, or you're doing watercolour painting. It's that kind of effect. And this does significantly increase perceived blur, and it is something which can catch the eye if you're sensitive to it as a user, and it's something which VA models are unfortunately renowned for, just to various degrees. And it's not too bad on this model. It might not even come out in a clear way on the video, because the sort of breakup trailing sticks reasonably close to the object. It's not a kind of extended smeary trail, and it doesn't have a sort of smoke-like appearance to it as some VA models will show. And this is really an example of one of the weaker pixel transitions. Most of them don't show this kind of effect. You can see not exactly breakup trailing, but you can see a little bit of what I call heavy powdery trailing around the flag post there and the tree. And actually there's some overshoot as well. There's not strong overshoot on this model. There is certainly a bit of overshoot. So you can see a halo trail, as it's called, around the tree and the flag post, particularly to the left of the tree, as I move my character left. But this, again, it's not particularly bright, not particularly eye-catching. There's also a bit of dirty trailing, and it's another example of inverse ghosting or overshoot around the lamp there. But this is really quite faint, and I don't find this eye-catching when I'm just playing the game normally. I'm just pointing out these weaknesses because that's what I like to do. If you've watched my videos in the past when I'm showing this kind of scene on Battlefield 5, you'll know I also like to go inside here, and that's because there are some additional transitions shown here. There are a lot of lighter shades, or very high contrast transitions I should say, so there's white against essentially black in the background there, so there's sort of white writing there against black, and on some VA models that can cause significant issues in terms of obvious sort of smoke-like smeary trailing. This model doesn't show that. It actually shows sort of what I call powdery trailing, maybe heavy powdery trailing. It doesn't have an overly smeary quality to it. The same with these pots here. Again, sort of some powdery trailing, but no sort of smeary trailing or anything like that. So overall, this model's pixel responsiveness is actually not bad for the panel type. It's better than, for example, the AOC Q3279 VWF, that's the original VA model of that particular monitor. And it's also better than the Philips BDM4037UW. And that is a curved 40-inch monitor that has particularly bad pixel responsiveness, and you can see sort of obvious smeary trailing all over the place, even using the optimal setting for the pixel overdrive. Now, speaking of pixel overdrive settings, I'm currently using what I consider to be the optimal setting. They're called Smart Response on this monitor, the pixel overdrive settings. So if you go into the OSD, go into Picture, you can see Smart Response listed there. I'm using Fast. If you have it set to off, there's just loads of smeary trailing. I'm not even going to bother showing you that. The faster setting, it may appeal to some people. So this setting, it essentially strengthens the overshoot. It's actually a lot more eye-catching now. There's some examples here. Around the flagpole, for example, there's really quite strong overshooting around the tree there. So this replaces some of the heavy powdery trailing, but you still get some clearly slower than optimal pixel transitions anyway, so you do get some extra perceived blur for that reason, but you also get this strong overshoot, and I don't find this very attractive. But by all means, have a play with the settings yourself and see what works for you. There's also another setting that's even faster, that accelerates the pixel responses further, I should say. And that's the fastest setting. But this is just a clear mess of overshoot everywhere. Really obvious overshoot. I'd be extremely surprised if this one doesn't come out on the camera and on the video, but really very unsightly indeed. The other aspect to consider is how the monitor feels when you interact with it. So it is a 60 Hz monitor, so it doesn't exactly feel amazing in terms of the connected feel, even if you're running at the fastest frame rate that would get the most out of the monitor, so 60 frames a second. It doesn't really feel awesome compared to high refresh rate monitors at high frame rates, but there is always input lag to consider, which also affects how the monitor feels. And on this monitor, it's nice and low, measured around 4 milliseconds. This monitor also supports adaptive sync. That means as an AMD GPU user, you can use FreeSync. And as an NVIDIA GPU user, you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. Both work in much the same way. There's only a slight difference, and that is that as an NVIDIA user, you can't use HDR at the same time as using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. Plus, you need to be using DisplayPort, whereas as an AMD user, you can use HDR at the same time as AMD FreeSync. So you can use them at the same time. As an NVIDIA user, you get obvious flickering. I showed that in the HDR section earlier. But what this technology does, adaptive sync, it works in much the same way on the NVIDIA and AMD GPUs overall. It has variable refresh rate range of 40 to 60 Hz on your AMD and NVIDIA GPUs, and it gets rid of tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. So at the moment I'm running the game at 60 frames a second pretty solidly. There aren't any dips really, so this technology doesn't actually come into play. However, if I increase the graphics settings, which I've now done, I'm just using the Ultra preset. I know people sort of like to know about this kind of thing, and I'm using an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti at the moment. So actually it's quite easy to get around 60 frames a second, but even so, when you're using the Ultra preset, or if the action intensifies or you're playing multiplayer, there are going to be dips below that. So you can see there, just occasionally my frame rate dips and my frame rate counter goes orange. It sort of displays about 57 frames a second. This would give obvious tearing, usually, if I had VSync disabled and also adaptive sync disabled. And if I had adaptive sync disabled and FreeSync enabled, I'd get obvious stuttering. But with this technology enabled, adaptive sync, you don't get that. And that's really nice. If, like me, you're sensitive to that kind of thing, it's really nice. It sort of just gives a more fluid experience. I'm now going to increase the graphics settings further. I've now boosted the graphics settings a bit by increasing the resolution scale slider, so it increases the rendering resolution. You can now see that my frame rate counter goes red sometimes, and that just means it's below 50 frames a second, so it's into the 40 frames a second. And comparing this to sort of around 60 frames a second, there is a decrease in connected feel, which I've mentioned before, the connected feel. And this is natural when the frame rate decreases. There's also an increase in perceived blur, which again is something which goes with the territory when you have a decreased frame rate. So that isn't something which adaptive sync can solve, but it certainly is nice not having the tearing and stuttering from the mismatches between the frame rate and the refresh rate. And it's something which sensitive users like me really do appreciate and will notice. Something to be aware of with adaptive sync monitors in general, they don't use what's called adaptive overdrive. That's something which NVIDIA G-Sync monitors use. What that means is that the pixel overdrive levels are retuned to various different refresh rates. So as your frame rate drops, and your refresh rate will also drop if you've got the technology enabled, the monitor will retune its pixel overdrive, use a different voltage surge for these reduced frame rates and refresh rates. That's useful because it avoids what you get with FreeSync monitors, and that is really the voltage and the overdrive is tuned for the highest refresh rate of the monitor, so 60 Hz in this case. And as it drops, you can have some instances of obvious overshoot, which isn't really as apparent at the higher frame rates. On this model though, although it doesn't have variable overdrive specifically, the overdrive is reasonably well tuned, so there is an increase in overshoot. I don't know if you can see this in the video. There's certainly more obvious overshoot behind the tree and the flag post there, but I wouldn't really say it's extreme. So I've increased the graphics settings again. It's now running at around 40 frames a second. The overshoot's increased a bit more. It's actually quite strong. Now it's not super strong though. Again, I wouldn't advise using the off setting because then you just get horrible smeary trailing all over the place, which really isn't very nice. And another thing is this is really at the very low end of what the monitor will support in terms of the refresh rates, very near 40 frames a second. And the issue there is there's a danger that the frame rate will actually go below 40, which does happen every now and then, on this scene for me even. And then the technology completely deactivates. You get adaptive sync disabling itself, you get obvious tearing or stuttering coming into play. That's because the monitor, as I said, supports 40 to 60 frames a second, and unfortunately 60 is not twice 40, therefore there's no LFC, low frame rate compensation, or anything like that. That the monitor simply will not support FreeSync or adaptive sync or anything like that below 40 frames a second or 40 Hz. To wrap up then, the monitor provides a nice pixel density and a nice screen size for the resolution, so that gives you a good amount of desktop real estate, and it gives you a nice level of readability for text and a nice sharpness, a nice clarity for suitably high resolution image content. Essentially, I feel that the 31.5 inch screen size is pretty much optimal for this resolution. The overall design of the monitor, it looks quite nice on the desk, I think, but it does have glossy black plastic bezels, which aren't my first choice, sort of fingerprint and dust magnet as I call them, and of course shiny as well, which can annoy some people. The stand has a nice feel to it, lots of sort of metal elements used there, sort of wireframe design, reasonably solid, not super solid, but sort of solid enough really. But it doesn't offer any ergonomic flexibility aside from tilt. For the monitor, you can tilt the screen backwards and forwards a little bit. There is provision for VESA mounting. There are VESA holes at the rear if you want to use them. The contrast performance of the monitor, very strong overall. It exceeded the 3000:1 specified, even following the adjustments made to my test settings. So it certainly offers much stronger contrast than you get from a non-VA panel. The screen surface had a bit of a graininess to it when you were observing lighter shades such as white in particular, but nothing extreme, not sort of a heavy smeary graininess. There is a bit of VA glow as a VA panel, but nothing extreme, and certainly for this size of panel, actually a fairly low amount of VA glow. Another VA characteristic related to the contrast is black crush, and there was a moderate amount of that as well, and just general perceived gamma shifts you have to be aware of with the panel type, especially when it's this large, and especially if you're going to be sitting quite close. So I like to sit around 70 to 80 centimeters from the screen if I can, but even at that distance there are some shifts in gamma to be aware of. So you get that black crush towards the middle of the screen. Further out you have a sort of lower perceived gamma, and you can have a little bit of extra detail in places, which isn't ideal either. But this isn't an extreme difference. It's not as extreme as, for example, the vertical shifts you get on a TN panel. These shifts also affect the colour reproduction, so there's a bit of a loss of saturation towards the edges of the screen and the bottom. But the overall look is still vibrant. The monitor's colour gamut extends far beyond sRGB and actually comes very close to full coverage of the DCI-P3 colour space. So this gives a good dose of extra vibrancy and extra saturation to the image. It's also appropriate for HDR content. So when you're looking at SDR content, this extra saturation and extra vibrancy, some people like that kind of look, but it certainly doesn't give a natural or realistic look to the image in the sense that things are pretty much universally oversaturated. Under HDR, however, that content is actually designed with the DCI-P3 colour space in mind, so saturation levels are more appropriate. And it does tone down the saturation, but it allows the game developers to use very saturated shades where they want them. For example, for fires, explosions, brightly painted objects, that kind of thing. They still look really nice and have vivid shades well beyond the sRGB colour space. But it's just the natural shades that look more in place, skin tones, the natural environment, that kind of thing. And just having the colour gamut supported and the monitor supporting HDR doesn't really mean anything. It depends how it's implemented. The HDR implementation can sort of screw up the colours quite a lot. But on this model, that wasn't the case. It was actually a very good HDR implementation in terms of colour reproduction. Whether I was using my NVIDIA GPU or my AMD GPU, the colour reproduction in HDR was very similar on both. You can expect that to be similar on a games console as well. HDR also uses 10-bit precision, and this monitor does indeed use that as well for the HDR10 pipeline. And that enhances the tone mapping capabilities, the tone mapping precision. So at both the high and low ends, you get a better nuanced variety of shades. And this becomes particularly noticeable when you're looking at gradients, such as the sky, smoke effects, that kind of thing. They're much smoother, and there's a greater variety of subtly different bright shades. The sun's rays, for example, show this as well. And at the low end, it's very noticeable in terms of shadow details, looking more realistic. You can see more detail in the dark areas, but it doesn't look sort of flooded like it would if you just lower gamma ordinarily, because it's actually achieved by a greater variety of shades. Contrast is also a very important aspect of HDR. This monitor supports VESA Display HDR 600, and the contrast performance was really very good overall. It had a peak luminance of 700 candela per meter squared. It also has 16 dimming zones. So in particular, when I was observing brighter shades and I wasn't sitting in a dark room, I actually really enjoyed the HDR experience. Those brighter shades really did stand out in a very nice way. They had a really nice pop, and the dimming zones helped those darker shades appear deeper than they would if the backlight was just set to a high brightness ordinarily and was just controlled as one unit. But having 16 dimming zones over a screen of this size, of course, isn't ideal. And some of the dimming zones, they become very bright. If there's any bright content on the screen or reasonably bright content, the dimming zones have the luminance lifted up, and particularly for the very bright shades, they're lifted up a lot. That can actually leach into the dimming zones, which are supposed to be dimmer, and raise their black point and just make the dark shades look lighter than they should. This was particularly noticeable if you were sitting in a dark room. You could actually see a spotlighting effect towards the corners for some of the dimming zones, and indeed just the general depth of the dark shades just wasn't where it should be. If you're sitting in the lighter room, it wasn't so bad, but you could still notice that the black depth was raised above what it should be. But I've used lots of HDR monitors and lots of different HDR implementations, and this is certainly one of the better ones I've used overall. The responsiveness of this monitor, VA panel, so not perfect, but as far as VA panels go, it's actually sort of moderate performance, not too bad. There were some instances of slower than optimal pixel transitions, giving a bit of a smeary look to the trailing in places, some powdery trailing in places, but nothing extreme, no sort of extended smeary trailing or anything which looked kind of smoke-like. And generally the weaknesses weren't as widespread or as obvious as on some VA models. And being 60 Hz, it's not fantastic in terms of the connected feel or the levels of perceived blur anyway. It also had low input lag, much lower than the Philips 328 model I reviewed a while back using this panel, and the same VESA Display HDR 600 implementation. So the input lag is much lower on this one, and that will please some users. It also supports adaptive sync, worked on both AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. So overall then, certainly not a perfect monitor, but then which monitor is perfect? Certainly a lot to like about it though. In terms of the HDR experience for brighter shades, I really enjoyed that aspect. The responsiveness was decent. I mean, it didn't have horrendous amounts of input lag or horrendous amounts of smeary trailing or anything like that, so it certainly could have been worse in that respect. And the colour reproduction, vibrant overall, and really nice colour gamut. The VA panel did have some shifts in colour, and there's certainly some loss of saturation peripherally. That was more pronounced than on the curved VA panels which I've used of this kind of size, but it still wasn't extreme, and wasn't as extreme as you'd see on TN panels vertically. And the contrast performance of this monitor, being VA's main strength, put that to good use. So that's really all there is to the Philips 326 M6 VJ-RMB, or if you prefer the Momentum 326M, it's a bit easy to remember. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.